Welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at Disaster Cover Journal. We thank you for joining us today. We hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. Everyone's phone has them muted, and we ask you to utilize the question panel you'll find on the right-hand side of your screen. Our speaker today will attempt to answer as many of these questions as possible at the end of the session. Today's sponsor is SAI Global and Strategic BCP, and the topic is life safety in the workplace. Our presenter is James Green. James is a Senior Consulting Manager at Strategic BCP and was recently awarded as the DRI Consultant of the Year for 2019. James is passionate about life safety and helps the C-suite understand the importance of business continuity, not just during an emergency, but as an integral part of day-to-day operations. James has spent the majority of his career in the financial services industry and has worked on risk events that have occurred all over the globe, including civil unrest in Egypt, executive travel and protection in the Pacific Rim, and the effects of destructive tornadoes in Oklahoma. James is a sought-after speaker and has been interviewed by multiple publications on the topic of active shooters in the workplace. With no further introductions, I'd like to welcome and turn the mic over to James.
Thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction. I'm speaking with everyone today from balmy Tampa, Florida. It's a chilly 77 degrees Fahrenheit here. I know some of our friends in Denver and other areas are having some challenges with the weather, so I apologize for any sunshine comments or poor jokes I make about that going forward. As Bob said, I work with SAI Global and Strategic BCP. SAI Global is a global risk management company. You can see a lot of stats about us here. We provide risk management software, we provide risk management advisory services, and we provide custom learning content. It's one thing for me to tell you how great I think my employer is, and it's another to show you. So as you can see here in my little 15-second sales pitch, we have been recognized and awarded by multiple prestigious organizations around our risk management, operational risk management, software and learning. So what does that mean to you, fellow business continuity practitioners? Well, as we're all starting to see, business continuity management needs to be part of the integrated risk management conversation. We can no longer, as BC professionals, just operate in a silo. We need to be connected with all these different aspects of risk. Business continuity is important and my life passion, but we're starting to see as the world changes, as the landscape changes, it's one integral piece of the overall risk puzzle. So my company, Strategic BCP, entered into a partnership a few years ago with SAI Global, and then last August it made sense that we became a full-time part of SAI. And that is the last of my sales pitch slides for today. So before we start, I want to talk about who we're not here for. So when I train and I work with companies on workplace violence and active shooter, we take a little different tact, right? I'm not former military, I'm not law enforcement. So we're not going to talk about perps, we're not going to show you pictures of guns, we're not going to show you doom and gloom. That's really not what we do here. Whenever I train, I kind of focus on, this is who I have in mind, right? This is Alice in accounting. Okay, so Alice is your typical office worker. She has no background in weapons, in threat assessments, in disarming people, just your typical Alice in accounting, typical office worker. We also do trainings for retail, warehouse space, medical, and all the training we do is really kind of focused on just our typical employee. So before we start, I want to ask a question here just to get an idea of who we're working with. So the question for today is, what industry or environment do you currently work in? And we'll give everyone about 45 seconds for this. This kind of just helps us see who we're talking with. Sometimes we have more in one group than another. Usually it's split over the 4. And I will try to customize some of our content on the fly here based on your responses. So we'll let this go just another few seconds and then we'll move on. And I see we still have some people logging in here, so to those of you who are still joining us, welcome.
All right, we've got about 85% voted, so we're going to go close
Okay,
it and
that sounds
publish it for
great.
you.
Okay, so a very high percentage of corporate today. Okay, great. So let me jump back to my slide here. Okay, great. All right, so I want to start with a little story that's a little atypical of what we normally do. But on March 8th of this year, I was in Wellington, New Zealand, of all places. And I was working with local government officials on business continuity and on crisis management and some natural disaster response and things like that. And they said, oh, James, you know, before you got here, we Googled you and we see that you do a lot of work on active shooter and workplace violence. And that's really not something that's applicable to us here in New Zealand. And then 1 week later, I got this call, right? We all saw this. We all saw what happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, less than a week than I was there. And the reason I share this story with you is we all know, unfortunately, the times that we're in, active shooters in the workplace, workplace violence are happening all around the world. So I'm not going to hit you with a lot of statistics today because I think the statistics are becoming chatter. We know things are happening. It's not a matter of if, but when in a lot of our lives. So we really want to, make sure that we're prepared for this. One stat I will give you, though, is this one here. It's 18 times more likely than your company will experience an active shooter in the workplace than you will experience a fire in a workplace. Now, the caveat here is that the odds of either one of these happening are really low, right? But kind of my point is, if we plan and train for one, why don't we train for the other? There's all kinds of life safety events in the workplace that are statistically low or rare, but we prepare our employees. So we want to spend some time talking to you today about we need to prepare our employees for all aspects of life safety. The first thing we want to do, we want to educate our employees. We don't want to scare them. So we recommend our best practices that active shooter training should be a part of your existing life safety program. So tornado and shelter in place are pretty common in a lot of locations throughout the world. Fire or evacuation are pretty common. We're starting to see workplace violence and what exactly that means besides active shooter, we're going to talk a little bit more about later on. We're starting to see this become training throughout the world. So we want to tell our employees we're just adding another layer to things that they're already familiar with. And I'm not going to even ask this next one as a polling question because I already know it's coming. What if we don't have a life safety program? Most of the companies I work with, this is the very first thing they ask me. And my response is, if you don't already have some aspect of life safety training, if you're not doing evacuation drills or fire drills with your employee or your staff, you cannot lead with active shooter training. If that's your first experience for your employees into life safety, you're going to scare them because they're going to think, hey, we've never done anything like this before, so something's got to be going on. Is this in response to James getting fired? Or is this in response to the person we saw in the parking lot? What exactly is going on here? So I can't overemphasize or stress this enough. You really want to have a holistic life safety program. We've even worked with some companies where they've designed logos and slogans. So they start with fire drills and they start with tornado drills or evacuation drills. And every time employees go through that type of training, they see that logo, they see that slogan, they get familiarity with it. Most adults in the US have done fire drills or tornado drills as a child in school. And then so we start with that. We do that for a few months, and then we add in this training for active shooter. They see the same thing about it's a life safety program, and it helps them understand, oh, this is just another way that my employer is trying to help me be safe in the workplace. So we're going to ask another polling question here for everyone. Have you participated at work in a fire or tornado drill in the last 6 to 12 months? And this will help us understand, based on what we just talked about, where are you at in your workplace today? I can tell you from past experiences with US-based companies, we typically see about 50% of the people answer yes to this, but I always like to see real numbers. Okay, so high number. That's great. So about 77% say yes, and less than 1% say not sure. That's always good. When I see the not sure as a high one, that always concerns me. Maybe we're not in the right room, but that's good. Okay, so about 2/3, a little over, well, 3/4. All right, so kind of a rhetorical question here, but for the people in the audience, I usually have people raise their hands or we talk about this a little bit. Do you remember what you were taught as a child in the event of a fire? And if you were raised in the US, if you went to schools here, you know that the answer is stop, drop, roll. And you probably never really thought about stop, drop, roll since then, but it's really effective. And there's a few reasons why. First, these words are simple, right? If English isn't your first language, or you're just learning the language, or you're a child, stop, drop, roll are simple words. We don't have to worry about misinterpreting them. And second, and more importantly, these words tell you exactly what to do, right? Stop, drop, roll, you know exactly what to do. So they're not only reminders, but they're commands. So we use a similar methodology for active shooter. Now, this was originally created by the Department of Homeland Security. I have seen every other type of methodology out there for active shooter training, active shooter response. I really like run, hide, fight because it's just as effective as stop, drop, roll, right? These are simple words. They're reminders, but they're also commands. The other reason that I like run, hide, fight in office environments and retail space and healthcare and manufacturing is you have to look at, again, who is the audience, right? So I love this picture of Homer Simpson with his, don't wake me, I'm working, and not to make disparaging remarks, but when you look at your employee base from top to bottom, strengths and weaknesses, who's your average employee? If you're in your office right now, if you were to stand up and look around, who do you see? What do you think their capabilities are? What are their physical limitations? Do we have employees who have disabilities? Right? I find that run, hide, fight is the most effective methodology to teach for your typical office population. Now, the other day we were working with some people and they were all a bunch of former Marines, right? They were all skilled, they were all trained, maybe different type of methodology. But for the typical employee at your company, this is a good way to train your employees. And the first reason to do this, and this is what people forget, these events happen quickly, right? So 70% of active shooter situations in the United States end in 5 minutes or less. So think about that for perspective. We've been talking just over 15 minutes. So that'd be 3. These happen fast. So that's how, when we talk about run, hide, fight, this first goal, leaving the building is always your first goal. Always. If these things happen in 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, if someone means to do you harm and they can't reach you, they can't find you, you've been successful. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these steps going forward, not necessarily about the tactics, but the thoughts and strategy behind them. So running is always our first goal, right? And if we can't run, we want to hide. But the caveat here is this is not a permanent decision. It's a temporary decision. Because again, we always want to be looking for a place to hide. And then as a last resort, truly as a last resort, you fight. So if we're in a conference room with one door and somebody enters and they mean to do us harm, we need to do something, right? We don't want to just sit there. We don't want to just look around. We don't want to wait for the police to come. We don't want to wait for someone else to save us. We have to act. So in studies I've read about crisis management during any type of disaster, there'll be 3 types of people. About 1/3 of the people will take action. 1/3 of the people will follow those people taking action. And then another 1/3 of the people may just be traumatized or paralyzed. So it's important, if you understand these steps, and if you're in this type of event and you say, hey, follow me, or hey, let's hide here, or hey, grab your laptop, you'll have people follow you and join that step that you're taking. Now, the tricky thing is with run, hide, fight, and we're going to, that we always struggle with, and especially with online trainings, is it's dynamic. So what do we do in a fire, right? We always evacuate. And if we're in a tornado or we're told to shelter in place, what do? We always stay in one location. Active shooter is dynamic based on information that we've been given. And that's why we're going to talk a little bit later on about another step that we add to run, hide, fight, because it helps us determine what to do. So the next question I get asked a lot, so we just went ahead and put it in here, is your parking lot your assembly area for building evacuations? So think about it, your company. If there was a fire right now, where's your assembly points? If you've had active shooter education or awareness, where's your assembly points? Most companies that we work with, it is the parking lot. Here's the problem with that. 2 things. First, if you have 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 employees and they're all standing in the parking lot, where are first responders going to go? We see time and time again that first responders are delayed and struggle with getting to the building, whether it's on fire, whether there's a threat of any type, because they have to park further away. And then once they park further away, they have to wade through all of your people. Another challenge to consider is if I'm an assailant who wishes to do you harm, or I'm a former employee who wishes to do you harm, all of your team has made it really easy for me. You've all vacated the building, which is amazing and excellent, but now you're all standing in one place. So think about that. So yes, we use assembly points because on paper they're easier, right? I can do checklists. I can see if James is here, James is not here. First responders like them from a fire standpoint. They can easily count people, triage. But in an assailant type situation, maybe consider going back to run, right? I tell my kids when I teach them this methodology, I have 2 boys, that you run and you run and you run some more. And one of my sons said, well, Daddy, what if I get in trouble at school? And I was like, we'll take care of that. You take care of yourself, Dad'll deal with the administrators. And so for a lot of our clients, based on their geography, we teach them the same thing. Look, if there's an assailant type event, we want you to scatter. Yes, it's messier on the back end to try to find everyone, to try to see where everyone is, but I'd rather have some logistical challenges and have everyone safe. So we're going to do another question here. If you had some type of threat or incident at your office, how would you be currently notified? So do you have a mass communication tool? Would you send email? Would you send text? Do you think it would phone tree down from HR or a manager? Are you not sure? Maybe you've had drills, but you've never had training on how to communicate. We'll give you just another few seconds there. And Bob will get us the answers. All right, so let's see here. All right, so we've got a good mix. Email, text, inform HR managers. Okay, great. All right. Every time we bounce from the poll back to my PowerPoint, it jumps to the first slide, so I apologize. All right, so we want to add, based on that, there's one more thing that we want to talk about, and it's alerting. So I read this study, it was just compiled last month, and it was from the International Rescue Committee, which I didn't even know existed until I got a copy of their white paper, to be honest with you, but it was really interesting. They were looking at effectiveness of notifying people in any type of disaster, right? So here you can see, for one company, my floor warden, Kendra, she's got her vest on, she's got her helmet, she's at the fire door ready to go. But what the rescue committee looked at is how fast do people respond during an actual emergency when they've been given notice? And so what they found is most people, when they hear an alarm, they think it's just a false alarm, or they think it's a drill. And so think about that for a moment. We are actually notifying the people in our workplace that something's going on, and 3 out of 4 people will ignore it. And this is why it's vital to have floor wardens like Kendra. It's vital to have that 30% of people who will say, hey, follow me, we're going out this door. This is not a drill. And the other thing that we found, and what alarm companies are starting to work with now, is what they call 2 minutes versus 2 seconds. And that is judging the actual response time from someone. And so for that loud alarm that we all hear, the average response time is 2 minutes. And if it's an audible voice, even if it's automated, that says fire, 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 the average response time is 2 seconds. And think about how big of a difference that is in an active shooter type situation. Again, remember earlier we talked about 70% of these are in 5 minutes, right? A good chunk of these are in 2 minutes. So if your employees had a response time of 2 seconds versus 2 minutes, that's a big difference. That saves lives. And so that's why we find alerting is very effective, and we want you to use every method of communication that you have. A lot of companies that we work with, we find they use one or they use two, or they're worried about over notifying. But here's the thing, in a disaster, we want every form of communication you have. It doesn't matter, use it all. We were just with a client in Barbados last week, and they actually had a minor, not while I was there, but previously, they had a minor earthquake. And I didn't even realize that earthquakes were something that could happen there. But they sent out an email. Well, what do you do if you're in the break room? If you're walking down the hall? If you don't have your phone? We want you to use everything you have. So if you have a mass notification system that you've purchased, amazing, use it. Even if you have it, send out emails, send out text, walkie-talkies, public address systems. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but I first want to direct you to this text from an actual event. A few problems with this text. So first of all, positively, they sent a text. Negatively, it says that it's on the campus. It doesn't say where. So we talked about run, hide, fight being dynamic, right? And I ask you to make that decision of run or hide or fight based on information. So think about here, if you get this text, let's say your campus has 5 buildings. What are you supposed to do? If the shooter's in building 1 or the assailant's in building 1 and we're in building 5, why would we shelter in place? Like this message says. I would want you to run. And conversely, if it's in the same building that you're on or the same floor that you're on, you need to hide temporarily. A lot of buildings have public address systems. They're the most common form of communication. You can be a retail store, you can be a gas station, you can be a manufacturing company. Most jurisdictions in the United States require them by law. So we want you to use them. But here's the thing though, you have to use plain language and not codes. A lot of companies want to use code language, and the reasoning that they tell me is because they don't want to alert the shooter that they know he's there. Well, I'll tell you right now, the shooter knows they're in the building because they're in the building. So we don't want to use codes that Elvis has left the building or Elvis is in the building or code black. And why? Here's a few reasons that we always find. One, if you only train your employees once a year and your training was 12 months ago, 11 months ago, they're not going to remember. Maybe your company's different than mine and everyone who takes their annual training is very diligent and takes notes and reads them daily and reads them on their way to work and at lunch. Most companies, your goal with a traditional compliance type training, honestly, is to get to the end as soon as possible to get that little certificate, right? So employees may not remember about Elvis. Your new employees may not have had that training yet. And then you may have people in the building, you have visitors, you have contractors, right? You have consultants like me. I was at a facility a couple of weeks ago and they came over the PA system, code plaid. What does code plaid mean? We're back in the 90s? Like, should I start listening to my grunge music again? I wasn't even sure what to do. So we want you to be explicit and clear. And like we talked about with the last slide, Give as much information as you have. If you don't have information, that's okay. But if you know there is an assailant in building 1 on the 3rd floor, say that. Because again, you're not giving anything away to the assailant because that person already knows where they are. Give me as your employee or your visitor that information so I can make decisions. So we want you to use run, hide, fight, but we want you to arm the people who may be in harm's way with information. So I want to share another thing with you that is often overlooked in training, because when we were preparing this webinar with DRJ, we know a lot of people train on run, hide, fight. We know a lot of people train on threat and assailant response, but we wanted to talk about some things around the edges that often don't get looked at, like alerting. And another thing that people kind of forget is law enforcement. Law enforcement will be engaged at some point during any type of incident, right? And your employees know that. But what they don't often know is that when law enforcement arrives on site, their goal, first and foremost, is to find and neutralize the threat, right? That's why these incidents happen in a short amount of time, because most law enforcement, they arrive on the scene, they enter your facility. And that can be traumatic if you're wounded or if you're hiding or you're scared and an officer runs right past you. But that's what they're trained to do. Neutralize whatever threat it is. So when you're working with your staff, when you're working with your employees, you need to let them know, hey, here's what's going to happen, right? We're not recommending that you run traumatic active shooter drills. I don't know if everyone here saw last month in Indiana, they were doing execution style drills. That doesn't help anyone. You never want to scar your employees, but you do want to educate your employees. You want to let them know, hey, if law enforcement's ever on site, here's their goal. And the second thing we see, and we see this every time I work with local jurisdictions on drills, officers show up at your place of employment. They've gotten a call that there's something going on there, right? They don't know who's who. They don't know if James is the employee. They don't know if James is the assailant, right? You're running around the hall screaming, maybe you're panicked, you're confused. You're asking those officers to make decisions in a short amount of time. So what we want you to do is we want you to have your hands visible, open and up as you leave the building. When we do this training in person, I like to run around the corner and hold my cell phone in my hand and ask people really quickly, did you know that was a phone in my hand? Was it a device? Was it something else? Don't ask these people to make these decisions in any type of drill. We did a drill last year and this person came out with their coffee, their Starbucks cup. And I went up to them afterwards and I said, what was your thought process here? And they said, well, it was a venti, it was expensive. And I said, okay, how much did this cost you? And they said, well, it was almost $5. And so then I looked at this person, I said, what's your life worth? Is your life only worth $5? And they got really upset with me on that question. But the point is, when you have an alarm, when you have some type of event, and it doesn't matter if it's active shooter, right? If there's an earthquake and you have to get under your desk, get under your desk. If there's a fire, don't stop and grab things. Get out. Keep your hands free and clear, because you drop stuff, the person behind you trips over it, it slows you down to get it, and now you're asking law enforcement and other first responders to make sure that you don't have a secondary device or something threatening. So just get up and get out. So I wanted to share some things with everyone that we've been working on at SAI that I'm very proud of. And marketing doesn't know this, but I'm going to share it with you live. So don't tell them, because I always get in trouble whenever I go off script. So my apologies in advance, marketing. We have some things to help with this type of training. And so earlier we had talked about life safety is more than just active shooter, right? It involves fire. It involves tornado. But it also involves, when you're looking at workplace violence, it involves other things besides active shooter. A lot of companies are training on active shooter or teaching their employees on active shooter, but they're not necessarily looking at some of the things that lead up to that. So we have these modules around mental health, bullying in the workplace, domestic violence. This is a tough topic, right? A lot of people don't want to talk about this, but if one of your employees is the victim of domestic violence, that could be brought into your workplace. So we ask that you, as you develop your workplace violence programs and response, don't just look at active shooter. Again, just like we talked about, don't just do active shooter as part of life safety. We want you to not just do active shooter as part of workplace violence. And I want to show you briefly how we do this at SAI and maybe some things you should consider at your workplace. People learn in different ways, right? Not one size fits all for training. So we like to offer a lot of different aspects to help communicate with employees. So we have the different modules that we talked about. We have an active shooter simulation, which I'd like to spend a few minutes showing everyone and getting your feedback on. We have videos. We have offline elements. A lot of people respond more effectively to face-to-face training, right? Or posters or wallet cards. We've even come up with facilitation guides for managers. If you're going to push this type of content and training to your employees, how are you going to make sure that they understand it? So in any respect, whether, again, any type of life safety training, any type of business continuity training, workplace violence training, it's more effective if you have multiple inputs. You've seen all these studies that we all learn in different ways. So we want to make sure that you train your teams in different ways. Just having videos isn't enough. Just having any one of these is not enough. So here's the biggest challenge that I've seen with online trainings. They're static, right? They lead you through something that goes one way. They're linear. And again, linear is great for fire training. Hey, we always got to get out of the building. It's great for tornadoes. Hey, we always had to shelter in place. Linear is horrible for active shooter training. We talked earlier about run, hide, fight, and it depends on the situation. You cannot have a linear training for run, hide, fight. It's not effective. So we've been working for several months on an immersive simulation. And we really struggled with, how do we make this realistic? How do we make the decisions realistic? How do we force people to make decisions? And we came up with a model that we basically created a decision engine. So as employees make decisions, their risk either gets higher or lower. And if your risk gets too high, the simulation ends. And if the risk stays low, you eventually get out. And it reinforces all the things we've talked about today with run, hide, fight. So with your permission, I am going to show this to everyone really quickly because I would love to get feedback on this. And I always like when marketing doesn't know what I'm doing and sales doesn't know what I'm doing and they get scared. So this is our training, and I want you to look at this. Please give us comments, but also think about the training you do for your company. So again, the goal of a training should be intense and relevant, but not scary or horrific. So you can see here the pictures I have in the background, they're stylized, right? So we don't need to show graphic images. People already know. So this is how these events happen, right? It is your typical workday. We've had incidents where people think they hear fireworks and they keep doing their work, but that's not what happens here. Some muffled noise in the background. We want people thinking, and you want your employees thinking, hey, are they, what is that? What's going on here? This is the one time we have a graphic noise to get people's attention. We talked about these events happen quickly, right? 2 minutes, 5 minutes, which is why we put some timers on here. You have to make decisions, and we reinforce the run, hide, fight training, which is what we want you to teach your teams to do, run, hide, fight. And we reinforce these decisions. Okay, run was a good decision. This is a low level of risk, right? So now we talked about you have some more information. This is what we chatted about earlier. Now we know there's someone with a gun downstairs. What should I do? Run away from the shooter, hide, run towards the shooter? So it's one thing to teach your employees at a high level about what run, hide, fight is, but we need you to kind of get into the weeds with them a little bit so they can really understand what they're doing. One thing I wanted to share with you for purposes of the webinar, there's no sound going on, but during our simulation training, we do have sound and sound effects. We'll run this just another minute and then we'll turn it over to questions. This is one thing we really struggled with. So you teach someone run, hide, fight, and it's clinical, right? Just do X, just do Y. But when you're in a situation, if you've ever been through any type of disaster or emergency, it's not clinical. Sometimes people will be giving you wrong advice or bad advice. So here we've got someone saying, hey, come here, hide with us. Let's cluster together. There's safety in numbers. But we've talked about earlier that there's maybe not necessarily safety in numbers. So this is kind of struggling with letting your employees struggle with, you know, the emotional implications of what they do here. And it reinforces those. So here I chose to hide with the group, and it doesn't say, hey, you're wrong, or hey, you died, or you made a bad decision. It just says, hey, that decision put you at high risk. Because we have to be careful as employers from a liability standpoint when we get into these types of situations. Our employees are not first responders by definition, so we need to be careful with what we tell them to do, what we suggest to do. And that's why whether it's with this training or other training, you know, you got to be careful telling employees, don't do this, you have to do that. Hey, this is high risk, this is low risk. It's just kind of reinforcing decisions. And here's the last one we'll do, and then we'll turn it over to questions. This is one we really struggled with. And we went round and round internally on this. So throughout our chat today, we've been talking about how running is the best thing to do in all cases. But now we have a wounded coworker. And a lot of companies don't train or discuss this. And then what happens is the first time your employee is dealing with something like this is when it happens. So think about here, you have a wounded coworker. Are you going to help them? Or are you going to not help them? Again, your company's not telling you what to do, but it's a personal decision. And so we reinforce that, hey, you're putting yourself at higher risk. And that's a tough thing to teach people, but you want to have those conversations during blue light, during blue sky, and not, not in the moment. So we're gonna put this back to our slideshow here. So we've given you some things to think about as you train your employees, as your staff. We certainly prefer to train on run, hide, fight, but what we wanted you to see today is just tactically teaching run, hide, fight to your team is not enough. You need to think about, how do you roll life safety training out in your company? Right? How does it fit your culture? What is the culture at your company? In addition to run, hide, fight, how are you sharing alerting of your team, your staff? Do they understand what to do when law enforcement shows up? And do they have some of the discussions, have you had some of the discussions with them around the implications of the different steps for run, hide, fight? So with that, I'd like to throw it back over to Bob for see what questions we have.
Wonderful. Thanks, James. And if you do have any questions for James, you can locate the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If we don't get to your question here today, James will have access to all of them, and we'll follow up with everyone after the webinar has ended here today. So we've got several. This came in already here. First question, why is it high risk to hide with a group as opposed to on your own?
So the reason is, if someone comes into a room, let's say we're all in a conference room, and I mean to do you harm. If you're all huddling together, if I have a gun and I shoot, or if I have a knife and I'm trying to slash at you, if you're in a group and my aim is a little off, I'm still going to hurt someone. If you're scattered throughout the room and you're solo, my accuracy has to be much higher.
All right, next question here. How do you train around an open office environment with no location to hide safely?
So that is one of my favorite questions. So personally, open office environments I've never been a fan of as an employee. And that's another reason why we struggle with a lot of schools and universities teach the methodology of lockdown, where you hide behind a closed door and you wait until help arrives. So the challenge with that is exactly like this person just asked, and the same thing I work with my kids at their school. How do you lock down at the playground? How do you lock down in the cafeteria? You can't. And it's the same thing with an open office environment. In that case, hide may not be an option. So you have to run or you have to fight. Because a lot of companies, we're seeing more cubicles, we're seeing more glass, open space. And so in those type of environments, hide is not really going to be an option for you.
All right, there's several questions around this, in particular who owns it, messaging, things like that. So who have you seen the main party initiating a life safety training? Just responsibility of BCM or bring in facilities, HR? It seems like it's a shared responsibility of all three.
Yeah, so honestly, historically, life safety is owned typically by facilities or HR. Obviously, I'm biased, but I'm a proponent of having life safety owned by risk. So if that's business continuity or enterprise risk or operational risk, because these types of events are risk-based events. The other challenge we often see, especially in larger organizations, is if it's not owned at a corporate-wide level, the training might be different, the frequency of drills might be different, and it really is on the employer to make sure that all employees are receiving the same type of life safety training. We have a large manufacturing company, and they were very proud to tell me that in 2 of their locations, they did fire drills, they did tornado drills, and they did active shooter awareness. And I said, that's great, but what about your other 17 US locations? And they hadn't gotten to them yet. And what are you telling your employees about the value of their life in that case? And if you ever were to have an incident, what are you telling OSHA and your insurance company about your priorities? So yeah, obviously I'm a risk guy, so I'm going to be biased and say risk should own it. But I think the key takeaway is if you have more than one location, it's got to be owned at an enterprise or corporate type level to ensure the training standards are met throughout the organization.
All right, we're on the 11th floor of the building. If the shooter's in using the stairwell, should we exit via the elevator?
Well, now we're getting really specific. I like it. That's hard to answer without seeing the layout of your building. So we could talk more about that offline, but we'd want to see, is the elevator near the stairwells? How easy is it to access the elevator and the stairwells, vice versa? So a lot of that would depend on the layout of your building.
All right, there seems to be an emphasis on evacuation as the best option in all situations. Why is it recommended to leave a room that has locked, secured door when you may not know where the assailant is?
So certainly if you don't know where the assailant is and you actually have a locked, secured door, you would want to consider staying there. It's been our experience that what's considered a locked, secured door is very rare. What does that mean by secured? Can I shoot through it? Can I shoot the lock? Can I see in there and see that you're there? So we put the emphasis on run and evacuate to get yourself out of harm's way, because unfortunately what we're finding is more often than not, unless you have a true safe room or panic room, the conference room or the space that you're in that you think is secure is not. Because bullets are not like they are in movies. I always love, I love action movies. My family and I love watching action movies. And I always love when our protagonist, right, dives behind a plastic folding table and it stops the bullets. In real life, bullets go through drywall, bullets go through doors, bullets go through a lot of things that you'd be surprised about. Car doors, bullets go through car doors. So we put the emphasis on evacuation because more often than not, the room you're in may not be as secure as you would like it to be.
All right, is it recommended to incorporate these life safety mechanisms into traditional business continuity training and planning?
Well, yeah, obviously I'm a BC guy talking about active shooters, so I'm going to say yes. But yeah, I think it should be, because you show our employees like, hey, we're thinking about tornadoes, we're thinking about hurricanes, we're thinking about workplace violence. These are all probable risk, and best practice for a business continuity professional, you should be training your employees and making them aware and making management aware on all types of probable risk.
All right, next question here. It is understandable that time is of the essence in notifying employees of an active shooter incident. However, how important is it, in your opinion, for security to verify what is happening before sending out an all-employee notification?
So the question is around false positives, right? Or false alarms. I would rather have everyone outside during a false alarm than inside during an actual event. So this is where some training needs to happen with your floor wardens, with your management, with your employees around who's making these calls, who has the authority to use the PA, who has the authority to use the mass notification system. You certainly don't want that to be a small group, right? Because if it gets too small, then you have single points of failure, which we all know is bad in our world. But it can't be so wide that maybe your first day employee hits a panic button that maybe isn't necessarily accurate. But I would certainly rather have false alarms than employee tragedy.
All right, can you talk about post-incident response? What are the top 5 to 10 considerations after an event?
Wow. Okay, well, we don't have time for 5 or 10, but I will give you 2. So the first thing that your plans should consider is that your office is now an active crime scene. And it would be the same thing if there was a fire and the fire department suspected arson, which means that your office is going to be closed to you until the either fire or police or FBI complete their investigation. So a lot of times in our business continuity plans, right, we see that facilities is going to go in and IT is going to go in and we're going to check the data center and do this, that, and the other. But if there's an investigation going on, there is no one allowed, period. So you need to factor that timeline into your response. The second thing that we've seen is after any type of traumatic event in an office, right? A fire is a traumatic event. If a tornado is a traumatic event, an active shooter is a traumatic event. When you get the building back to business as usual, your employees may not be emotionally ready to be business back as usual. So I worked with one company a few years ago. They did have a workplace violent event in the office and resulted in some cleaning and some repairs. When they finally got that done, they had all the employees come in on a Saturday. They were a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 type place. They had people come in on Saturday just to kind of walk around, see how they felt, see if they were comfortable. It's a big mistake after any type of event just to throw everyone in first thing Monday morning and not allow them to process what happened. Some people were good to go. Some people needed to spend some time away from the office. Some people just needed to walk through and acclimate. So we certainly want to look at and have in our business continuity plans, you know, the emotional well-being of our employees after the fact.
All right, well, wonderful. We've got plenty of questions here we did not get to here today, but we're running out of time. So again, if we did not get to your question, James will have access to all these questions. We'll follow up with everyone after the webinar has ended here in the next few days. So any parting words here today, James?
Just thank you everyone for your time. Had some great questions. Like Bob said, please forward them through and we'll make sure that we try to get to as many of them as possible.
All right, wonderful. Thanks again, everyone, for their attendance here today. We again hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank James for his time here today, as well as Strategic BCP and SIA Global for sponsoring today's webinar. We will be emailing everyone a link to the recording. You may view this recording as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar.